This is Leverage, the podcast about power, politics, and influence. I'm Kristal Taylor.
And I'm Breon Wells.
And we are BG as well, right? Isn't that the spirit, the moment that we're in right now, twin? Immediately in the aftermath of Brittney Griner pleading guilty, right, to, I guess, possession as part of her detainment in Russia. And can you set the stage, like what's been going on? She was detained in Russia since February. Like, who is Brittney Griner? Bring our listeners up to full speed so we can have this conversation about BG and everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, so Brittney Griner is a WNBA basketball star. She plays for the Phoenix Mercury. And, you know, she was detained in Russia in February for carrying a very, very, very small quantity of cannabis oil. Is that what we want to call it?
Yes, like 0.07 grams
of
hashish oil.
And we will unpack here in a minute why she was in Russia. But this, of course, happened. What else was happening in February was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so there has been, since the beginning, a lot of speculation on the why. Why Brittney Griner? Why at that time, at that moment, was she being leveraged out of anger that Putin had about, you know, the United States posture as he was invading Ukraine? Was he looking for a political swap of prisoners, you know, for Brittney Griner in exchange? And so it's been just under, I want to say 200 days that she has been in prison and in Russia. And at first, there was no designation that was given. And so there was, at a certain point about, I want to say a couple of months ago, is when they finally, the United States classified her as wrongfully detained. And that's a significant designation, because what it does is it allows for like her wife, Sherelle Griner, and the mass public and these WNBA players and these NBA players and all of Brittney's supporters to really hold this administration accountable to do everything that they can to get Brittney Griner out. And so, and mind you, she's not the only one that is detained. You have Paul Whelan. You have a number of other folks who have been detained as well for long periods of time. One of the things is Brittney is the most known of the groups that has been detained. And so, as you said, twin, just recently, this week, she pled guilty to the charges that were brought against her. And that guilty plea does not mean that she was in fact guilty and will be found guilty. But what it does do is it opens up some more access points legally, for instance, so that, you know, her case can now be seen as, in order to be swapped, if that's what Putin is trying to do, this political prisoner swap, or it allows her to be able to ask for clemency and get done this clemency. I want to contextualize, though, for our you know, subscribers, the Russian court system is not the U.S. court system. The Russian justice system is not the U.S. justice system.
It is very, very pro-prosecution. And there's been some speculation that, you know, this plea of guilty on her part, it's like, what is it? Something like 99% of all criminal defendants in Russia get found guilty. Correct. Or something like. So, I mean, you know, I think you raised a really good point about the potential avenues to basically try and get Brittney back that are only opened up once her case is closed. You know, like they can't even fully engage in the diplomatic process, as it may be, right, until the criminal case that she's currently facing is resolved. And, you know, this guilty plea that she entered was July 7th or 8th. And then
Yep.
her next court date is something like July 14th. So I think there could be a lot of movement over the next week or so.
Yeah, and I think, keep in mind, again, Brittney Griner is not the only one. And so
Right.
we would be irresponsible not to unpack this in its fullness, that we do need to acknowledge that this is a Black woman who is part of the LGBTQ plus community,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and, is a female athlete.
Highly decorated female athlete.
Right.
Like,
And so in one sense, the world is starting to see from a different lens what many other families of prisoners are
correct.
dealing with, and sometimes the limitations that administrations have. That's not to give the administration a pass, but it is to
Mm-hmm.
say we have gotten a different glimpse and view into how, these sorts of things, because you've had people who were detained in Iran. You've had people who are detained in Russia. We've done political, prisoner swaps with the Russians in the past, but this is the first time that you've had a high profile person.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
let's unpack why she was there, though. She was there because she's in the WNBA,
And
and
makes
one can't help
about,
but,
right.
yeah, one can't help but outline that your average WNBA player at the higher end, that is highly decorated, like Brittney Griner, is making about $200,000 a year.
Correct. And so one of the
And
things
that's on the
that,
high end. So
and
you've
that's on
got
the high
some still
end,
making 60,000 a
right? That's
year.
on the high end. And one of the things about this whole situation that just bespeaks just political gamesmanship and outright just tomfoolery, because it's not like this was Brittney's first time in Russia. She has
This is her
actually
10th
been
season.
playing.
Her
She has
10th
actually
season.
been playing in Russia in her off season, to your point, for 10 years. So it's not like she's a brand new figure, not an unknown commodity, right? And it's like you talk about the ways in which her brand, her image, everything about her is being leveraged, at great expense, at great cost, for well, don't let me try to project what um, Vladimir Putin has in mind as part of this whole dynamic. But you raised some very interesting points, both about the timing of her detainment and its correlation to the invasion of Ukraine. Also, when you start talking about these political prisoner swaps and some of the names that have been elevated as a potential prisoner swap, it's literally like, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he's like a 25, he's been serving like a 25-year sentence,
Murderer.
arms dealer, murderer, like aid and abet terrorists.
Yep.
And that's who y'all want for Brittney, for BG. Like it's wild.
Well,
It is
and
truly wild.
I mean, and I don't think we should be shocked though, right? Because we've already said the justice system, and therefore the value system, is, at least on the face of it, different here than it is in Russia, right? Here in the US. And so to them, that's what they call Monday. But I think we have to as well acknowledge, and I will say this: there's been speculations about Putin's health and his frame of mind and his state of mind. But I would say as well, we can't deny that there may have been a strategy in choosing, of all people, Brittney Griner.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not forget that Russia did exploit fissures of race in the 2016 election that this country didn't want to talk about, but they were all too happy to fill in the blanks, right? And try to exploit for their purposes. And so when you choose a Black LGBTQ high profile female, it starts to beg the question, why was she in Russia? Why did she need to go? For instance, is LeBron James playing in Russia in the offseason? The answer would be no. Is Steph Curry playing in the offseason in Russia? The answer is no. It's simply because it bleeds towards this lack of pay equity, yet again, for women, including, yes, in the athletic arena. It's what Megan Rapinoe and other voices have been screaming about in other facets of this. So that, you know, even Megan Rapinoe's partner, Sue Bird, used to play in Russia. It's actually, Brittney was not the only one. You have a whole host of players in the WNBA, because they're getting paid comparatively peanuts to their male colleagues, that are, you know, and they don't get endorsement nods at the same frequency as their male colleagues, and they don't get that way. So she was there to supplement her income.
Right.
And it's funny that they could have picked anybody. Again, she wasn't the only one. They picked Brittney Griner for a reason.
For a reason. And isn't she also, you know, when you start talking about ways to supplement income, isn't Brittney also the first openly gay athlete to be signed to Nike as part of an endorsement deal?
I think so. I think that might be true. Look, don't give me the line, twin, but I think she's definitely one of the, if she's not the only one, it's a very small handful that is newly, you know, endorsed.
No, I mean, like the pay equity piece is really interesting. And I'd be curious to know, what is your retort to people who then counter the pay equity dynamic, specifically for the WNBA with, oh, but it's not as profitable as the NBA. Oh, you know, like they're not making as much money. Do you think that that argument holds any water, or does it go back to like, nah, y'all still across the board just refuse to pay women what they are worth, regardless of the industry?
So I think that, I'll say this. I think it's always, and every dollar we spend at the individual level and at the societal level, or that we choose not to spend, is a reflection of our values.
Correct.
And so I would say that it is easy to simply stop at the door of the WNBA and the NBA and say there's a pay gap and y'all need to fix it and work it out. When the truth is, we as society need to do a better job of expressing our values and holding people accountable. You know, women outpace, you know, and women, there's more women than men in this country. But the interesting thing is, this is where you start talking about power dynamics. And you start talking about what is, right? And how do you best leverage moments to transform cultures? And so I think the same argument has been made and leveraged against Black people. You know, we're not seen as profitable. The quality of our stuff is different. You know, they don't want to call it bad. And what they mean is that difference is not welcome here because we don't like change.
Isn't that also interesting how at the same time that Black people are undervalued, Black people are the first and, you know, perhaps only people in the United States who have been commerce before we could participate in it, right? So much of culture, especially when you look at pop culture, emanates from Black tradition, Black community. And yet it's almost like you're saying Black culture isn't valued or valuable when on display by Black people. But if we can cap on it, yes, we love Black culture in those regards.
Absolutely. And the same would be said in this case for gender and gender equity, right? That as much as it allows us to check a box and say, hey, we're diverse, we're not Russia. We're not, you know, these other countries. We have arrived in a space. It is this false narrative. And so I think the politics of it is twofold. You have the bigger international landscape of the politics of this, which is, you know, why did Vladimir Putin pick Brittney Griner of all, even if we just start with the WNBA players who frequent Russia? Or you also have plenty of Americans who play volleyball in Russia. another space. Volleyball is not as popping as basketball and as
Mhm,
football.
mhm,
So you have plenty of athletes that go out and to other spaces to help supplement their income and get better opportunities, get more
mhm,
exposure.
mhm,
So
mhm,
why out of all of those picks was it Brittney Griner? Also, now at the domestic level, the politics of this is it sheds light on our values when it comes to gender pay equity, when it comes to
mhm,
how we treat Black people, Black women,
mhm,
and the extent to which, even as, to be clear, thus far, the United States seems to have taken the same path as every other detainee, whether it was Russia or in Iran, US detainee that is abroad.
mhm.
But one, politically, this is the first time more eyes are on it than ever before. Like,
Right.
the people you and I know, Kristal, for the first time, they're like, wait a minute, we have these political prisoners. It's been on the news, but it
Right.
just hasn't hit home as much. But that other politics part of it is the same treatment that you give typically these white males that have been political prisoners when you try to use that same measurement against Black females who have been taken abroad.
Mhm,
Does that suffice? Is it enough? I mean,
mhm,
you are in some ways doing something at the same way that you always have done it, and in these
mhm,
precedents, so you haven't been discriminatory per se.
mhm,
But given that, pesky systemic and institutionalized racism and the history of this country and sexism and the gender spaces, what does that bring to bear for, is it enough, or how does it translate at least to the people? And the people seem to be saying, you're not doing everything that you can.
yeah. It's funny. I saw something online the other day that made a comment to the effect of, if this was Tom Brady, he would have been back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like if this was insert name of any prominent male athlete or any prominent white male athlete, they would have been back by now. And you can't help but wonder. Now, granted, yes, let us acknowledge that these past nearly 5 months or so have been replete with broad scale chaos, right? You think about all the things that have happened in this country over the past few months since Brittney's detainment. It strikes me as very interesting the way the media has handled this situation, that it isn't given greater visibility or higher, attention and notoriety. And it reminds me of what you were just saying a few minutes ago about the ways in which these different dynamics of race, of gender, how they play out on a national stage in terms of, well, whose stories are valuable, whose
Yep.
lives are valuable, what are the narratives that we want to advance for top line consideration, and you almost have to, you just have to kind of take a beat a little bit and say, so for all the different dynamics that are at play, is it really that hard to get Brittney back? Is it really that hard to be more vocal, more visible about this? Or is there yet another round of like ulterior something?
Yeah, and here's the thing, because I heard and I remember, listening this week to some of those arguments that were saying, had this been Tom Brady, he would have been back and we would have gotten him out. I don't know that I fully agree with that statement.
Mm-hmm.
And here's why. And don't get me wrong, Paul Whelan, I'm not suggesting that Paul Whelan is as known nearly as Brittney Griner or Tom Brady. Most people didn't know that Paul Whelan was in here until Brittney Griner got detained. But
Mm-hmm.
Paul Whelan has been in prison in Russia since 2018.
Mm-hmm. I was about to say about 3-4 years. Right.
He's been in there for a while, and so I think the argument is less even that it's it's just the government would have had a different energy had it been Tom Brady. I think the real argument that needs to be made is the system doesn't work especially if you're Black and brown and multi-marginalized, because the system
Right.
isn't working for Paul Whelan, a white guy
Correct.
who has no name, right?
Correct.
Or and I don't
Correct.
mean that as in a dismissive way. I'm talking about as
Right.
far as
Right.
being known in these spaces, right? And so this is, I think, as you and I talk, as you know, when we talk about leverage and the arguments that should be made, or the angles that need to prove to be the most effective, you know, I think that the focus needs to be on the fact that the current system with which the United States government has shown up to this doesn't seem to be suitable, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your gender, because we don't know that Tom Brady would be home by now. What we do know is it would get immediate press coverage. What we
Right.
do know is he may have some money and, you know, some friends who may decide to do some off the record special ops sort of stuff, but that's not the government moving. And we need to make that distinction. The government is still going to be the government. And right now, the government's playbook is not working, has not been working. And Brittney Griner's detention proves that, I think. So they want to reevaluate.
So to that point, like, what do you think are, you know, some of the takeaways or some of the messages for Americans, period, who might want to travel abroad, who don't have resource, who don't have notoriety, who don't have, you know, big name visibility? Like, are we entering into a space that says it's worth you reconsidering how you engage, you know, elsewhere, because you might get snatched up, and if you get snatched up, your government may not come save you, you know? Like, is that this moment that we're moving into, or does that, you know, do we prefer to say, well, no, like, you know, generally these types of situations are, you know, reserved for those who could somehow be leveraged as political capital? Like, where do you think we are on the spectrum on that?
Yeah, I think so. Ooh, twin, that's a loaded question. because I think there's a couple of things that we need to acknowledge, right? One, I don't think that folks should change their travel plans. And, you know, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean travel everywhere and anywhere. Like, still look up on that State Department advisory board and, you know, adjust yourself accordingly, as we say in the church, you know, address yourselves accordingly. But I think on the same token, we need to acknowledge that American exceptionalism, which, let's be clear, has been in some ways American arrogance. And I'm separating that from, I'm about to get to Brittney Griner's situation in a minute. I'm separating that clearly from Brittney Griner. But this American exceptionalism that says that I can go in someone else's culture and do what I do at home, that might get you locked up in these other spaces. And so it's really a question of, just because you can do some things, should you, especially when you're going into someone else's culture. One thing I don't think that we do enough of in America is learn how to exist in someone else's culture and respect that culture, full stop.
Well, of course not, because
you know,
listen, think about, like, America itself is like this melting pot that never melted, right? As Tony Kushner says. And it's fascinating to me because this idea of American exceptionalism causes too many Americans to believe that this is the greatest place on earth, even without reference to ever leaving,
right.
the
You didn't
borders
have
of
the
this
data.
country.
You didn't have the
You didn't have the
experience to say
data.
so.
You just believe the hype, and you out here thinking like, oh, we are the best thing smoking, and I get to do what I want to do because we're American. And you can't do that.
Yep. No.
You really can't do that anymore.
And you do have some people that go abroad and they do violate rules in other countries, and then they get detained. And in those cases, it's still the different nature, and some would say even brutal nature of some of these spaces, that we do want to get these Americans out. But let's also address the elephant in the room, that this American exceptionalism that has really been practiced as arrogance has caused people to get clapped up. Now, when we talk about the Brittney Griners of the world, part of the solution and where you could solve the politics of it is take the air, the oxygen out of the room. What do I mean by that? That means if we know that Putin may have strategically chose her because she was Black, LGBTQ, female, and a well-known athlete, that no matter how well-known you are, you're still Black for what it means in this country. You're still LGBTQ for what it means in this country. You're still a woman for what it means in this country. Then how about the United States? It shines a light on the fact that we need to seriously do the work internally so that those things and those factors can never be exploited again. Like that's the reality, that you have this American exceptionalism on one side by some who go over there that are American and just go with all their arrogance and all I can do whatever. And then you have others who are just a byproduct of the racial social construct and hierarchy of power, that they have been oppressed, and they go over. And of course, that who wouldn't, and I hate to say it like this, but who wouldn't pick a Brittney Griner if you're trying to be the pettiest?
Right. And it's so funny to that point. One of the questions that keeps coming back to me that's really fascinating to me is, again, this idea, this was not her first trip. She's not new to Russia. She is a superstar on Russian women's basketball, right, for all intents and purposes. And apparently, many of the basketball leagues in Russia are, connected to, funded, and supported by Russian oligarchs, right? And so there's part of this equation where you're like, so what is this bargaining shit in the background? Because if your star player is detained and can't do anything, like, you would think that there's some greater level of friction or dynamic in the back end that has nothing to do with what's happening in America, has nothing to do with our government, but you would think that there's some level of engagement that ostensibly would be happening, because, like, just from the perspective of you trying to protect your investment, right, in this superstar player who helps your team and does whatever else. And I can't help but also think about then how some of our government's response to Russia's actions in the Ukraine, different sanctions and whatnot, the impact that that's had on oligarchs, some of the Russian oligarchs over there. And if, to your point of petty, if that is somehow even part of what's involved in all of this, like it almost feels like a Shonda Rhimes show, because there's just so many off the wall kind of dynamics. But I can't help think about just what is that Russian money piece in this, and how come things don't seem to be playing out differently yet?
Yeah, well, and I think so. One, sanctions take time to manifest and actually impact, right? Which is why some were trying to pressure the Biden administration early on, well before February. I believe 24th was the day that Putin invaded Ukraine. Well before then, they were saying you need to put these, sanctions out. Now, the Biden administration was clearly looking at these sanctions as a deterrent. At least the threat of it would be enough to deter him from acting. And clearly, Putin said, to quote one of the right. I mean, he basically said the Real Housewives, "Who gonna check me, boo?" He was like, "Who's a?" And so I think, this is why the argument was, if you're going to make this play, you need to do these sanctions well before, so that by time, like at the point he started articulating that he might go ahead and invade Ukraine, put the sanctions. If for no other reason, then we had the annexation of Crimea in 2015. We had Georgia, that used to be called South Ossetia, or is now called South Ossetia. We used to have Georgia that was taken over by the Russians. They have a pattern in practice. Like, he wasn't bluffing, he wasn't playing. But I think, to your point, the other more important spot is, and the reason why I say I connect Brittney Griner and the 2016 election, I think it's because in 2016, we saw that Russia disinformation campaigns don't mind leveraging and exploiting racial divides, specifically, not just gender, but racial divides in this country. And there is no current evidence that would prove that what they did is changed any tabulations of any votes, that there was a cyber hack, right, that came in and changed votes to, push one way or the other. What they did is they exploited through social media the conversations we did not want to have in this country, the issues we refused to address. And so then now, when we pick, again, a Brittney Griner, which it was not a mistake, I say is very strategic, it was because she was not just a woman, it was because she was Black. And here it was to yet again exploit. And so the United States really needs to consider the fact that Putin is not the only one. You may have other actors in the foreign space that will continue to exploit the racial divides that some of the colonizers,
not today, colonizers,
that they absolutely put to bear and gave birth and rise to these systems. The last thing I'll say, though, is shout out to Sherelle Griner, because in one
just
sense,
finished law school,
right, she has had to carry that weight on her back. And what she did, though, she did something that at least I have not seen done by most families who have been had a loved one detained. She, first of all, refused to be silent. She refused to do this, let's just get along behind closed doors. Had she been silent, I don't think she would have ever gotten that phone call from the president of the United States and the vice president. That mixed with the fact that her wife is well known, right? But she refused to be silent. But the other important thing that I have not seen ever, in my knowledge, to my knowledge, happen before, she actually shouted out and was advocating for the other families, like Paul Whelan's families. So here we have a Black woman who is now still in the midst of her own turmoil, putting other people on too. I can't, to my memory, recall when we've had some of these other families that was like, oh, well, let's also lift up these other families that are out there, let alone if they Black or brown.
Right. I think the urgency as well that she put behind this call to action is like, get BG home, get them all home, and do whatever it takes. Now, there's exigency, there's power in saying our lives matter and have extreme value. So whatever petty games y'all want to play, keep us out of it. Just bring our people home.
That's right.
She's been so adamant and passionate about that.
I think the last little, just because I'm feeling slightly a little petty today, too. The last little thing I'll say, and we can unpack this in a future episode, but it really causes us to think on the fringes of the reality of globalization. Globalization has its benefits, right? In the sense of, you have interconnected economic systems, you have these interconnected political systems, you have these social constructs with which it makes it harder, not impossible, but harder for actors like Putin to want to go it alone and really take over spaces, right? Because you have a connection. They had McDonald's over in Russia. They've had, these other spaces. But one of the things that we have talked about in this age-old fight of globalization, whether it's good or bad, we have not, those that do stump for globalization, which I would say is not altogether a bad thing. But the other reality of it is, it's built from a white normative space. And so that's a reality, right? And this goes back to the systems and the structures and even the procedures and the processes that governments have.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that, again, that the Biden administration was sitting on the sidelines saying that it's Brittney Griner, it's a Black woman, we can forgo this. No, the problem is they won't acknowledge that the system is not working, never was working for a vast majority of Americans, wasn't even working for your white men. So that means it was definitely going to be ill-equipped for it to work for a Brittney Griner. And for them to not acknowledge that there's still a level of white normative and facets of white supremacy, even in globalization, because what are you globalizing? You're globalizing white constructs.
Colonizers.
That's right, colonizing that has in many ways been oppressive to anybody that doesn't fit that rigid cookie cutter mold. So when you have a cookie cutter mold on how to deal with ransom, this rigid structure on how to deal with those who are being held ransom, you've already
Right.
you're at a deficit.
You've lost before you won.
That's right.
Before you even got started.
That's right.
Well, I mean, there's still so much to unpack. We didn't even get to touch on, the drug of choice, the crime for which she was actually attained. This 1.7 grams of cannabis oil, which raises a whole other line of conversation around the criminalization of marijuana, both in the United States and abroad. Conversation for another day.
Yeah, but I think real quick, Twin, the leverage piece of this, I think that folks should continue to lift their voice as they have been doing. I think people should take notes, right? For some people, Brittney Griner was their first reference point to how governments work, especially when there's people that are held hostage by foreign countries. So take those notes that you all have taken now that you see a better glimpse, continue to do that research, but lift the voice until Brittney Griner is home. But then also, after Brittney Griner is home, we need more Black and brown and other folks to be engaged in this conversation of, this is yet another space where that system is not working.
Does not work.
And how do we pull up at the table to help these governmental structures understand that this needs to be an overhaul and that we're here to help them from a prescriptive way rebuild how this works.
And let the church say amen. There it is. This is Leverage, the podcast about power, politics, and influence. I'm Kristal Hyde Taylor.
And I'm Breon Wells.